Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really plunging into something that affects so many families. It involves huge sums of money. We're talking about why reading reform in America faces these, incredibly persistent obstacles. And it's not just about teaching methods. It goes much deeper into the system itself.
Right.
We're focusing on part 3 of this really eye-opening investigative report. It's from the Unlocking Phonics Project and their AI analysis team led by Humphrey. And this part is called The Bureaucratic Wall: How Educational Bureaucracies Systematically Block Reading Reform.
Yeah, and pulls back the curtain is a good way to put it. The report dives into the money, the financial flows, and what it actually calls perverse incentives.
Perverse incentives.
Yeah.
Meaning incentives that actually kind of encourage reading failure.
That's the core argument, surprisingly enough. The report lays out how the system, maybe unintentionally, benefits financially when kids don't learn to read effectively.
Just think about the scale here. We're talking over $50 billion invested every year in literacy education. $50 billion.
Huge numbers.
Yet the national average, something like only 31% of students are reading at grade level. It's pretty staggering when you put those two things together.
It really is. And that's the central puzzle this report tries to solve. It suggests the bureaucracy itself has created financial reasons not to succeed too quickly because success, ironically, could mean less funding for certain players.
Okay, so our mission today is to really understand what the report calls this reading failure money machine.
Exactly. And look at the blockades, it argues, are systematically put in place against proven, effective reading instruction. Let's try to unpack this financial landscape.
Right. So given that mismatch, huge investment, poor results, the report then traces where that $50 billion actually goes, who's benefiting. It identifies something called the revenue protection matrix. Sounds serious.
It does, and it's meant to be. It's a framework showing how different entities are, according to the report, financially tied to the current system, the status quo.
It sounds like a whole ecosystem built around, not solving the problem.
That's the implication. The report tracks the money, taxpayer money, flowing through federal, state, local channels down to districts, and then it says into 4 main buckets. And the argument is each bucket benefits when reading proficiency stays low.
Okay, what's the first bucket?
The first one is publishers. The companies selling the curriculum materials, textbooks, software. They bring in something like $4.8 billion or more annually just from these sales.
Wow.
Yeah, think big names. The report mentions Heinemann pulling in $1.6 billion just in the 2010s. Fountas Pinnell, maybe $60 million back in 2012. Pearson, a huge global player, $5 billion in revenue in 2018.
So big money in educational materials. But how does that link to failure?
Well, the report's critique is this. These publishers often profit more from complex, multi-year programs, things that need lots of components, ongoing training, constant updates.
Oh, okay. Rather than something simpler.
Exactly. Simpler, maybe more direct phonics instruction that if it works quickly, you don't need to buy as much stuff next year, right? It reduces the ongoing revenue stream.
So it's almost like selling complexity is more profitable than selling a straightforward solution that actually works efficiently. That's quite a claim.
It's a central claim. The complexity involves multiple parts, workshops, special assessments, all adding up year after year. If a basic, effective method taught kids to read reliably in, say, a year or two,
the demand for those big packages would drop off.
Precisely. And the report argues the cost of that complexity falls on the students who keep struggling, needing more and more intervention, which in turn requires more resources. It's a cycle.
Okay, so that's publishers. What's the second major category the report identifies?
The second one is professional development. And this is a really big chunk, estimated at over $15 billion a year.
$15 billion on training and support.
Yeah. Think consultants, workshops, university programs. The report points to examples like Lucy Calkins' group at Teachers College getting $31 million from New York City alone over about 6 years. Or reading recovery programs, which collected millions in state contracts for years before many faced criticism about effectiveness and started losing favor. Universities also earn billions from ongoing consulting, specialized training.
So, again, the same logic applies. If reading failure was significantly reduced,
a lot of that demand for ongoing intervention, retraining, specialized workshops, it could potentially dry up.
It's kind of startling. The support system potentially relies on the problem persisting. Does the report suggest how PD should work? Maybe focusing on long-term results?
It implies the current model rewards continuous intervention rather than lasting solutions. A shift would mean funding based on actual, measurable, sustained improvements in student reading, not just hours of training delivered. That's a fundamental change in incentives.
Okay, publishers, professional development. What's the third area?
Third is assessment and testing. This is pegged at around $2 billion annually.
$2 billion just on testing reading.
Primarily, yes. And the report's angle here is that the demand for a lot of this testing is, in a way, created by the ongoing reading failure.
How so?
Well, if lots of students aren't meeting benchmarks, schools feel pressure to constantly test, to document the problem, track incremental progress, or maybe the lack of it, manage all the data systems that essentially track failure.
So failure generates the need for more testing, which documents the failure, which justifies more testing.
That's the cycle the report describes, a self-perpetuating loop where significant resources go into measuring the problem rather than maybe fixing the root cause.
Okay. And the fourth category?
The fourth is administrative overhead. And this is another big one. The report estimates it at $10 billion plus annually.
$10 billion in administration related to reading.
Related to managing literacy programs, compliance, and, the report argues, managing the consequences of reading failure. So, bureaucratic salaries, staffing levels. They're justified, the report suggests, not necessarily by preventing failure, but by managing the ongoing problem, overseeing programs that might not be effective, ensuring compliance, handling the fallout.
So it's almost counterintuitive. Could more failure actually justify larger administrative budgets or more staff?
That's the provocative idea. Bigger problems can sometimes justify bigger budgets, more personnel to manage those problems. It's a potential perverse incentive right at the system's core.
Wow.
And if you broaden the lens, the report connects this back to universities too, arguing that some education schools might perpetuate the cycle by not fully equipping teachers with the science of reading initially.
Which then creates the demand for all that professional development and remediation down the line.
Exactly. It's presented as this interlocking web of financial self-interest. Publishers, PD providers, testing companies, administrators, even parts of academia, all potentially benefiting from a system where reading failure persists. That's the core of the bureaucratic wall concept.
Okay, that paints a pretty bleak picture of the system's underlying mechanics. But the report doesn't just stop at diagnosis, right? It actually offers solutions, concrete steps to break down this wall.
Right. It moves very clearly into recommendations. It doesn't just say things are bad. It lays out a multi-pronged strategy, starting with immediate legislative actions, federal, state, and local.
Okay, let's start at the top. What does it propose for the federal level?
The big one is using the power of the purse, withholding federal funds for methods proven ineffective. Specifically, it calls for prohibiting Title I funds, and that's huge, over $16 billion a year for disadvantaged kids from being spent on materials based on the 3-queuing method.
Okay, hang on. Remind us quickly, what is 3-queuing and why is it seen as problematic?
Sure. 3-queuing, sometimes called MSV, teaches kids to guess words using meaning, does it make sense? Structure, does it sound right? And visual cues, does it look right? Often just the first letter.
Instead of sounding it out.
Exactly. The critique is that it discourages systematic decoding, breaking down words by their sounds, which is crucial, especially for kids who struggle. It promotes guessing strategies over foundational phonics skills.
Got it. So ban federal funding for that. What else at the federal level?
It also recommends requiring IES certification for any reading curriculum bought with federal money. IES is the Institute of Education Sciences, their research arm, so basically demanding strong evidence of effectiveness.
Makes sense.
Also, mandating science-based reading instruction across the board for federal programs, and interestingly, calling out the Department of Education itself, remove reading recovery from lists of recommended programs, stop federal employees from promoting balanced literacy, and force disclosure of any financial ties officials have with publishers.
That's pretty direct. Yeah. Targeting the money flow and the official endorsements. What about the state level? States have huge power over education.
Absolutely. At the state level, the report pushes for sweeping curriculum reform. Things like explicitly banning 3-queuing methods right in state law, mandating phonics first instruction, really ensuring that systematic decoding is taught from the get-go.
So changing state laws and standards.
Yes, and also overhauling teacher preparation, requiring universities that certify teachers to actually prove their graduates understand and can teach using the science of reading methods.
So making sure new teachers are trained effectively from the start.
Right, and prohibiting balanced literacy approaches, which often include those guessing strategies, from being taught in teacher prep programs. Plus, financial accountability, track reading results by the type of curriculum used. Maybe even create legal liability for districts that knowingly stick with ineffective methods.
Liability. That's a strong mission. Okay, federal, state. What about down at the local district level, where teachers and kids actually are?
For local districts, the focus is on transparency and accountability. Things like requiring public reporting, telling parents exactly what curriculum is being used, what methods are being taught.
Empowering parents with information.
Yes, and personnel accountability. Mandating that anyone in a literacy leadership role must be trained in the science of reading. Tying performance evaluations, maybe even job security, to actual student reading outcomes.
So real consequences for not using effective methods.
The report goes there. It suggests enabling termination for administrators or staff who actively resist implementing evidence-based practices. It's a push for compliance with what the science says works.
Okay, so that covers policy changes. But the report goes deeper, right, into structural reforms, like trying to dismantle the money machine itself.
It does. It moves beyond just laws and regulations to changing the underlying structures and incentives. For example, creating publisher liability.
Meaning publishers could be held responsible if their materials don't work.
Potentially. The report suggests things like requiring efficacy bonds. Publishers would put up money, like a guarantee, and only get it back if their products demonstrably improve reading scores.
Wow, that would change the game.
It certainly would. Also, mandating they disclose any research that contradicts their marketing claims. For consultants, it suggests licensing requirements and prohibiting conflicts of interest, like getting kickbacks from publishers whose materials they recommend.
Cleaning up the consulting field.
And for universities, tying some federal funding to how effective their graduates actually are at teaching reading in the classroom, and requiring them to disclose their own faculty's financial ties to publishers or consulting gigs.
This is really about disrupting those financial flows we talked about earlier, hitting the incentives head on.
That's clearly the strategy. Another piece is creating alternative pathways.
Alternative to what?
Alternative routes for training reading specialists, for instance. Bypassing traditional university schools if they aren't aligned with the science of reading, fast-tracking people who already have strong training in systematic phonics.
So creating competition, in a sense.
You could see it that way. And also creating more independent oversight, citizen review boards, maybe parent committees that have real power to evaluate and even veto the adoption of reading programs in their districts.
Giving more direct power to parents and the community. That's interesting. And then it lays out an implementation plan, like how to actually do all this.
Yeah, it's quite detailed. A 3-phase strategy over 5 years, almost like a military campaign plan.
Okay, walk us through that. Phase 1.
Phase 1 is immediate disruption, year 1. Focus on getting the key legislation passed, aiming for reform in 15-plus states, getting that federal funding ban on 3Qing, and launching a big public awareness campaign, kind of an information warfare element to build support.
Okay, hit hard and fast with policy and public opinion. Phase 2.
Phase 2 is systematic replacement, years 2 and 3. This is about personnel changes, replacing administrators who resist the reforms, and institutional changes, really overhauling those teacher preparation programs.
So changing the people in the training pipelines.
Right. Then Phase 3, consolidation and defense in years 4 and 5. This is about making the changes stick, embedding the reforms deeply, maybe even trying to get reading science requirements into state constitutions, and setting up sustainable funding to make sure things don't slide back.
It's incredibly strategic. And then there's this section on special tactics for bureaucratic resistance. That sounds intense.
It is. It anticipates pushback and suggests direct countermeasures. One is the sunshine strategy, basically radical transparency. Mandate public disclosure of everything, PD spending, curriculum votes, financial ties. Shine a light on it all.
Use transparency as a weapon.
Exactly. Then there's public pressure. Naming and shaming officials or districts that block reform. Creating public databases, tracking obstruction, even enabling recall elections for officials who won't implement science-based reading.
Wow, playing hardball. What about the money tactics?
That's the financial pressure strategy. Directly cut funding streams to programs identified as ineffective, but also create positive incentives, reward districts that adopt effective methods quickly, maybe penalize those that drag their feet.
Carrots and sticks. financially speaking.
And finally, maybe the most aggressive, the legal warfare strategy, using the courts, filing constitutional challenges, arguing for a right to effective education, suing districts for educational malpractice if they knowingly use methods that cause reading failure, challenging conflicts of interest through lawsuits.
So really using every tool available: transparency, public pressure, financial levers, and the legal system.
That's the approach outlined. And to make it concrete, they even provide a model law.
Right, the Reading Science Accountability Act. What's in that?
It's a template for states. It explicitly bans 3Qing and MSV, any kind of guessing strategy, mandates systematic explicit phonics, requires state approval for curricula, but only based on independent research, not publisher claims. It requires competency in reading science for all literacy staff, teachers, coaches, administrators, verified possibly by annual testing. Sets up financial accountability, audits for program effectiveness, and crucially, creates enforcement mechanisms. Maybe a dedicated state agency, and it allows citizens to sue districts that don't comply.
Giving citizens legal teeth to enforce the law, that's quite comprehensive. So after laying all this out, how does the report define success? What does victory actually look like?
They give concrete metrics. By the end of year 1, they want to see 10 plus states pass major reforms. By year 3, a measurable jump, like a 15 percentage point increase in national reading proficiency, and seeing achievement gaps start to shrink noticeably.
Ambitious goals.
Very. And by year 5, the target is 75% or more of students reading at grade level nationwide. A massive improvement from the current 31%.
So a near total reversal of the current situation. What's the report's final takeaway message?
It's pretty blunt. The conclusion is that the current system is essentially designed to fail, or at least allows failure to persist, because over $50 billion flows to groups that benefit from that failure. The incentives are backwards.
But it doesn't end on a hopeless note.
No! Crucially, it argues this bureaucratic wall is vulnerable. Why? Because the money propping it up is mostly public funding, taxpayer dollars. And because proven solutions do exist, the science of reading offers effective methods, and importantly, public awareness and momentum for change are growing.
So it sees an opportunity for real change.
Yes.
Yeah.
It concludes the wall is not impregnable. It calls it a house of cards built on deception, greed, and institutional inertia. And it insists that with sustained pressure, a clear strategy, and real commitment, the wall can and must be torn down. It's a call to action.
Wow. What an incredibly detailed and, frankly, provocative deep dive into this bureaucratic wall.
Yeah.
Dennis Humphreys and the Unlocking Phonics Project have really laid out a case here. It paints this vivid picture of how finance and bureaucracy get tangled up and why so many kids struggle with reading. It really shifts the focus. It's not just about which teaching method is best in theory, but about who actually benefits financially when things stay the way they are.
Absolutely. And the report's challenge, I think, is to make us see that this wall isn't some inevitable force of nature. It argues it's constructed from inertia, yes, but also from self-interest. And if it's constructed, it can potentially be dismantled.
Right. But it requires understanding those mechanisms, the money flows, the incentives.
And applying pressure strategically, using the kinds of tactics the report outlines. It's not easy, but the report suggests it's possible.
So, thinking about this, what does it mean for you listening? I mean, understanding these financial angles, these detailed strategies for reform, it might change how you look at education policy debates, right? It's suddenly not just about curriculum A versus curriculum B. It's also about, well, follow the money. How might knowing about this money machine, as they call it, change how you engage with your local school board? Or what kind of questions you ask about state legislation? It definitely gives you a different lens, a more critical one, perhaps, for evaluating efforts to improve reading. It really makes you ask that fundamental question. When our children learn to read effectively, who stands to gain? And perhaps who stands to lose? It's something to think